Speak Up Afrika is a digital platform that creates space for digital conversations to be made, specifically from end-to-end usage, from the users of the technological spaces, to the producers of it, to the creators, to the innovators, to the labor rights, to the policy increments, to governance, and all other technological dimensions. This is Speak Up Afrika. I am Zaha Speaks. We inform, engage, and empower. What's up, everyone, and welcome to Speak Up Afrika. I am your host, Zaha Speaks, and today I have a lovely guest, a mentor, a friend, and a very important contributor to this topic today, which is privacy and data protection. I'll give us the honor to have him introduce himself. Welcome to the podcast.
Hi, Zahan. It's a pleasure to be here. Zaha Speaks. It's quite apt. My name is Irungu Houghton. I'm the Chief Executive Officer or the Section Director of Amnesty International Kenya.
How did you find yourself in Amnesty? How
did
the
I get
ED?
to Amnesty? So it takes me back to 2017. And two things happened fairly close to each other. The first was Police Sergeant Rashid shot two men in Eastleigh.
Yeah.
And I was really horrified by that. And he did it on, he was videoed and there was no arrest that was made after that. The second thing that happened was, if you remember that period, we were coming out of the elections, 2017. And I saw a lot of violence that really worried me in terms of the period between the two elections.
Yeah.
And I made a declaration that if a job came up within Amnesty International, I would take it, but only the Kenya job.
Yeah.
I wasn't interested in the regional job. So when the regional job came up, I didn't apply.
Yeah.
And then 2 weeks later, the Kenya job came up.
Oh.
And I applied.
And how has it been so far?
It's been a roller coaster. I have a lot more gray hair. I have been to more mortuaries and police stations and courtrooms than I've ever been in my life.
Yeah.
But it's very satisfying because I think most of the work we've done has seen fruit. I mean, if you think about the work that was done last year around the protests movement, but essentially representing people who have been arbitrarily arrested or helping to find people who have been abducted or going to court essentially to press for justice for people who have been hurt by police officers and getting judgments, I think has always been, will always be probably my most, rewarding part of my life. Yeah.
It's very good. Noticing that Amnesty does deal with data and privacy, and specifically around workers' rights too. I'm very keen to hear what are the most pressing data concerns that we're having in the country right now, and how do they affect Kenyans and overly, but equally workers.
Yeah. So I think we have to recognize that the world globally now is much more digitized than it was 10, 15 years ago, right?
Yeah.
We have a government that, if I quote the president, he said something along the lines of, we have to jump 40 years of data governance regulation and digitize services. And his ambition was to essentially put all services online. Yeah. There are real opportunities with doing that in terms of access. And if you think about all those communities in places like Malindi and Kilifi and various, Isiolo, and essentially not having them trekking all the way to Nairobi, as I remember they used to, or even to capitals of counties, is such a liberating thing. And on the other hand, it does bring the state into every aspect of our lives, right? Yeah. So it means that the information that we give one government agency could be used by another government agency without our permission. Yeah. So for us, the wake-up call was in 2019 when we saw a series of things happening. We saw the Registration of Persons Act essentially amended without much boo-ha, and essentially what they did was include biometric data into that process. And then we saw the attempt to introduce a CCTV camera policy, which essentially would have ensured that in a single mainframe, the government would be able to watch every single public space in the Republic without any data protection law in place, right? The third area was really the census. And this was a really difficult moment for us because we watched carefully the census process. And of course, censuses happen every 10 years and not every year. They are the basis upon which development is designed. You can't do development planning without accurate statistics, but we had already begun to see some gerrymandering of, different communities and exaggeration of certain communities online. And then the thing that really worried was just before the census and after the pilot was done, 3 questions were introduced into that census that essentially made all of us vulnerable to essentially being identified, not just in terms of all the other questions, all the other answers we'd given the government, but essentially also because they were using notebooks and tablets for the first time that were GPS enabled. They could not only, identify the, whatever it is, 26 points of data that historically and by law should be anonymized.
Yeah.
But they could identify those 26 points of data with us and where we lived. So I personally did not allow myself to be enumerated because I felt this was such a violation of data privacy. And most of our staff refused to do this. But unfortunately went ahead. So it means that the government then had, equivalent to Cambridge Analytica 4 years before that, 26 points of data on millions and millions of Kenyans. And this was unlawful and extremely dangerous. And then, of course, the last one was Huduma number, which was a complete policy misadventure.
Yeah.
Abusive, intimidating.
Misusive.
And completely the wrong use of digitization.
And Huduma number has been such a crisis over time. What happened to it? Where did it go? Where did our data go?
So we actually don't know where our data went to. What we do know was that a lot of data was collected. The ministry has continually argued that they did not use that data, that it was fraught with, data flaws, and therefore wasn't very useful. And when they were introducing the Huduma Maisha program 2 years ago, Maisha number, they essentially had to start again from scratch. But I think the difference between the two programs was the first was abusive and intimidatory in the sense that the state said that if you did not register, we wouldn't give you services. It's an anti-constitutional position to take. Whereas with Maisha number, I think the difference has been that we were able to, to advocate for a data protection impact assessment to be done. There has been an attempt to change the law, so it is captured within a legal framework. And more importantly, the measures that they've taken have to be in line with the Data Protection Act.
Yeah.
And I think that was the major difference. So we wait to see whether there is the system is more inclusive, whether it is less abusive to misuse, and secondly, whether it actually ultimately does what it should do, which is to give government planners accuracy in terms of planning for the rights of Kenyans. Health,
but the Maisha number,
so
I got my ID just recently, and the Maisha number has an expiry date on my citizenship.
Yeah. Well, they keep saying that the system is not able to accommodate a end of, like a full life period. Whether this is true or not, I think the proof will be in whether in 10 years' time you go back like a passport and then your application is rejected. So the idea of a renewal is very much in line with passports, right?
Yeah.
So we don't worry about passport renewals, except when the state is unable to renew our passports in good time.
Yeah.
But I think the trick will be 10 years from now.
To try and see.
Yeah, that's, I think.
Otherwise, I lose my citizenship overly.
Yeah, I mean, I think I would advise you to go to Katiba Institute and get them to file a class action suit and restore your citizenship.
So now I think Kenya is such a digitalizing space, and we saw it especially within the protest time. Do you think this surveillance and data misuses that we're seeing in government and in other spaces trickle down into surveillance of Kenyans generally, and also for workers? I mean, we have a lot of data that we do give companies, our names, our house numbers, our etc. Right. How safe is that, and what is the idea around that?
Well, let me start with the workplace. I think the workplace, of course, has changed dramatically. Many companies are now using apps to collect data on all aspects, whether it's our leave, our medical records, our performance records, and even basic biodata about us. So it is increasingly now becoming a very digitized space. Everything we do in the office is, either on a phone, a tablet, or a computer. And there were lots of conversations during COVID-19 about, people working remotely and companies needing to know where they were. So there were lots of apps, for example, that could check how much FaceTime you had on the screen, or how many keystrokes you were making, or how many emails you were generating, or documents you were touching, and so on. So technically, if you're using a Microsoft environment, all of that capacity is there for not just your employer to use, but even for employees to use against each other. Just to give an example, the OneDrive, which is a Microsoft product, has a system where you can actually see how many OneDrive files have been opened by who, and how many files people have generated.
Yeah.
And I think one of the things that has to be introduced very quickly for workplaces like those is essentially a data protection policy that does not allow the employer to punitively go after employees on the basis of this. But of course, the tension between workers who have integrity and are not watching Netflix while pretending that they're working is another question altogether. Essentially, if we are contracting with an employer, then we are contracting for a certain number of hours, with a certain purpose to the job, and the company is legitimate in wanting to make sure that you're using that time productively, in the same way that you would expect the employer to pay your salary at the end of the month. So I think there's a balance there, but I think the key thing is really a data protection policy and a data protection impact assessments, and ensuring that employees opt in rather than have this happen secretly behind their back. So everybody should know what data is being collected upon them, and they should have the right to consent to that or not, and they should have the right to have that data deleted after they leave the organization. I think that's the big challenge. But this is formal economies. I mean, I think the other question is, for the wider world, the informal sector, 70% of the population and so on, increasingly as they're using money apps and they're borrowing and using borrowing apps, I think the danger there is even more apparent, because there's no real space for you to negotiate as a community for policies that essentially protect you. And your knowledge of how the systems work is much less than if you're in an office. I think those are the major dangers. For workers, I think the law, I think the Data Protection Act is a good act broadly. Of course, as it rolls out, and we're now just celebrating the 5th anniversary, there needs to be a lot more activism, particularly labor-based activism. But I get a sense that the trade unions are asleep at the wheel, that they're not following up on these issues. So I think this is where civil society organizations who have been doing work on data governance need to, I guess, refocus themselves, so that we are working with, labor unions, we are working with medical unions, we are working with health unions to make sure that those environments are much more in line with the data governance principles than they have been.
I think that's very interesting, because we're having a conversation with Odanga here on the podcast, and we were deliberating on how labor rights and labor issues around data have stopped being a labor issue for the unions and trades, like medical facilities, the health sector, education, everything is now getting into the data space. But before we dive into that, I think last year was a very big brink of how tech in just largely can really affect governance and digital rights in this country, and trickling down to the fact that we've seen people lose their lives after their data leaking and them being found and being abducted, etc. I just want to know, how does data privacy intersect democracy and governance, and especially freedom of expression, specifically for Kenya?
Well, I mean, the right to free expression is what differentiates us from a brick, right, as human beings, right? That's the only major difference between us and bricks in some ways. And therefore,
and building bricks.
And building bricks, construction bricks is what I meant, right? I think it's so important that we do not allow for that right to be derogated or to be denied in any way. Right? And that is the case even when it seems like we are saying things that are offensive to people. So just to go to one of the most significant moments in 2024 was when we started to see activists use artificial intelligence to create images of the president in a casket, or to essentially, falsify and modify, what looks very real. And those people were abducted, they were held, they were tortured, and they were released without any compensation or any justice.
Whatsoever.
And one of the things that, I have repeatedly said was that if this moment was one that required legal interpretation. Like, is this treason? Is this a defamation? Is it, satire? Is it art? Right? And on top of that, how much of the production or how much of the image is actually intellectually attributable to an individual, or is it just part of this new AI technology that's there? I mean, there are some important legal questions that are there, but nothing justified the level of violence that those people went through, right?
Yeah.
So I think that's one significant moment that Kenyans experienced last year. The second one was the use of telephone records and access to telecommunications data by the telecommunications companies. And I think this is probably one of the darkest moments of last year.
Yeah,
that people
with a lot
were
of backlash to Safaricom and the like.
Yeah, and rightly so, I think. I mean, I think what I've missed a little bit with Safaricom's response has been, how do they restore the trust that was there, that actually my phone number is between me and the telephone company and anybody else that I would like to give it to. Rather than essentially it being, fair game for police officers that don't have the lawfulness to come in the daylight, but actually come at night, not uniformed and not essentially coming to take you to a police station to charge you, but essentially to just abduct you and hold you for months. I mean, I think now the oldest abductee it's almost 90 days. I mean, this is the case of Peter Muteti that was found just recently.
Yeah.
So I think this has to be a moment where we kind of introspect and essentially hold the telecommunications companies accountable. The last one, I think, relates to the issue of other service providers. I mean, essentially what we're hearing now is that the squads or the operations units that are task forces that are essentially abducting people or arresting them are essentially triangulating lots of data. It's not just your phone to find you, but it's also, a Kenya Power and your power, your Wi-Fi. It's also to do with, your taxation record and, how much money you're spending on M-Pesa and where's that money going. I know for Amnesty International in July, for example, we came under scrutiny because there was an intelligence report that suggested that we were somehow behind the Gen Z protests.
You're funding us.
Yeah, exactly. And when I was able to meet with the intelligence officers, and I said to them, listen, you have all the information you need to be able to determine whether we are funding the Gen Z revolution or not. You can go to our bank account as Amnesty's. And it's public record. All of that information is with the PBO Regulatory Authority. You can go to the banks. You can go into my M-Pesa records and see, did I send money to Hanifa's fund, etc. You can check all of this. And if you're doing the work professionally, you will see that, this was a very organic movement that, yes, attracted resources, but ultimately to resolve the tension that they have generated in society, rather than going after people, you need to just resolve the complaints that they're making.
Yeah, the issues that are being raised. Yeah,
that's the important thing.
It's very interesting because
so we have some work to do.
Oh my God. I think they also called out Ford too.
As well, yeah. And I'm sure they didn't stop at Ford's website. They went and looked at transfers.
Yeah.
But you saw how that story disappeared, right? Because I assumed that there was no evidence. There was no evidence.
But there's none. Like, people were showing up so organically, like it was literally now started becoming like a funky to go to. Like, actually missing out was like the weird thing to do at that time. Anyway, what role do you think public institutions, specifically now that we're targeting, how they are also on the back end of receiving a lot of, again, infringement in trying to figure out, where is their positioning when it comes to governance scrutiny, especially? What role do public institutions and civil society specifically, especially for Amnesty, play in ensuring that there's ethical data practices in both government and employers? Because now I think we're in a space whereby workers are not having a lot of organizing going on to protect themselves. So where do we stand as public institutions and civil society? What's our role?
So if I start with Amnesty, one of the things we're very... I think a lot more aware of than we were 2 years ago, is in the process of organizing. For example, we have membership, right? Membership produces data. Data can be sold. right? Or it can be leaked. We do a lot of campaigning work online. We will take photographs, we will video, we will be in public spaces. We work with children a lot, right? And essentially one of the challenges is that it's no longer acceptable to just capture people's images or their data and release it, So we've had to think a lot more about kind of safeguarding processes. And that's difficult for an organization like Amnesty, because if you want to show impact, for example, of the work that we do with school children, the easiest thing is to show images or videos of children articulating themselves after they've gone through a human rights education class, But that's now much more complicated, right? So I think there are some operational challenges that we have as a result of this. But I think these challenges pale against the importance of protecting somebody's data, And we will make mistakes, right? And this is the thing that's there, because essentially these you may have a policy, you may even have a culture of doing this, but if somebody walks into a space and is not cognizant of what they're doing from a data protection perspective, they can release people's data. Right. And then the question is, what's the response? What's a I guess would you say a responsible way of correcting what you've done? And the obvious first one is deletion. Delete it. An apology. Tightening up training and awareness raising. I think that's the other thing. Now, this I think can happen across different organizations. So, for organizations that hold large databases, I'm thinking about Kenya Revenue Authority, the political parties, the e-citizen and BRS recently, the business registry system. The dangers of hacking, right? Not just sloppy data protection policies, but really having people come into your system and just release large amounts of data.
Cybersecurity in government
it's huge. I mean, you're talking about 14,000 cybersecurity attacks in a year, right?
And billions in website attacks too.
It's crazy. It's a different world. I think that's the thing, and I think the thing that I was bring us back to is what are the fundamentals? The fundamentals are essentially we must have the right to express ourselves. We must have the right to control what happens to identity. We must have the right to all the intellectual property that we produce, and everything else is secondary. Right? So really building an ecosystem and an environment in which people feel safe, not just in physical spaces, but online spaces is critical. And just be aware that, it will take some time to push us into this arena. And we're not really that from a number of countries. I mean, the things that you see in Kenya are still way ahead of the things that you're seeing in different countries. I mean, Uganda, for example, right? But even I guess what you'd call European and American society, American data protection is terrible. I mean, literally terrible. And that's why, for example, Meta and the big social media platforms don't want to be regulated by Kenyan law. Right? Because the Kenyan law is much sharper. And they will be held much more accountable for what they do.
Here. That's interesting. Do you think trade unions and specifically civil society, we have the capacity to push back when these things happen, when the violations happen?
I don't think we push back hard enough, to be honest. I mean, I think trade unions, I'm hard pressed to really think of a strong trade union-led accountability process with regards to data protection. And I know there's been an attempt to create a Digital Workers Association. That's great. There's a new data professional society. That's great. But I don't see, traditional unions going in this direction. I don't see a lot of human rights organizations going in this direction. I mean, there are a handful. I think the work that Katiba does in terms of public interest litigation is great. I think ICJ has been really interested in digital broadcasting and what impact that has. Amnesty, we focused, I think, at 3 levels. One is essentially to keep the Data Protection Commissioner independent and fearless, because like the Auditor General, if you don't have an independent office, the first violator tends to be the state itself. I think the second area has been really thinking about young people and what experience do they have of the of being a netizen, right? What is it that they?
I'm happy you know that
experience?
term.
Yes, I've learned a little over the last 1 year. So, but the other one I think is let me just throw another term I learned recently, which is technological authoritarianism, right?
Yeah.
Which is a bit of a mouthful, but essentially the weaponization of technology against people. Not just in the algorithms, but in the targeting, doxing, and abuse of people online. And I think we have to keep reminding people, even when they are people who see themselves as being active citizens, that there is nothing courageous, there's nothing lawful, there's nothing honorable as a citizen when you attack another citizen on the basis of their identity, right? And in that regard, homophobia, violence against women, violence against children, violence against the elderly are really, the same process, and nothing is justified. Nothing that, reduces the quality or the dignity of a human being is acceptable.
Which is what I actually wanted to mention. Next on, there's this new alligator in the space, and it's technologically facilitated gender-based violence. And the crippling effects that we're seeing is to a point where people are committing suicide upon various attacks in different systems. What do you think that looks like? What does protection for that look like?
Yeah. So strict regulation, I think, is really important, and continue to evolve the laws so that there is enforcement of the right to dignity, for example, is one thing. I think the second thing is really building resilience, because I think a lot of it comes down to wellness and mental health. And it's not to say that we will resolve the violence by focusing on the victim, but it is essentially to empower a population that is able to take action very quickly when somebody's being targeted. I mean, the way that bullies get away with bullying,
cyberbullying is...
But it's the same way when it was physical bullying, right? The only way that a bully got away with it was that everybody stood around and watched or cheered or walked away. But as soon as the marketplace, the community said, no, that's unacceptable, and you got a chorus of voices, it's actually difficult to bully somebody in that. So I think what we are also not seeing yet, and I think this is maybe the next generation of organizing, is solidarity, support, the crowding out of negativity through positivity. And I think that's another way that we, the nation corrects itself, right? It's not always about laws and state action. It's also about, active citizenship says, no, that's acceptable. That's unacceptable. Stop it. Stop.
But also such as simple as stalking. Anyway, just as we wrap up, I'm thinking through Kenya in the next couple of years. I'm thinking through the fact that especially the young Kenyans are very digitalized. Also, are you digitalized?
Yes, completely. Is there any Kenyan who's not digitalized? Including both our parents and our grandparents. They're still there.
Do you have TikTok?
Yes.
Do you do TikToks?
Not often.
You dance?
I do dance, but not on TikTok. And I'm not going to do it now, so don't ask.
I was about to.
I could see that. I was like, if you just fell into that one, no one could do that. No, seriously, like which Kenyans are not interacting with some form of digital? The level of internet penetration, the number of gadgets that we have, the smartphones that are there, and even if you don't have a smartphone, the reality is that as soon as you get into money, lending, or as soon as you get into, even going to the national park now, you have to have an e-citizen, right? So I think the boat has really crossed the Rubicon of I'm just going to remain here in my physical space.
And my Katululu.
Yes.
It doesn't work anymore.
No, it's gone. And I would say good riddance. It's gone. I think there is power. No, I mean, this is just a personal view, but I think there is power. Like if I think about it, like, without LinkedIn, how would I talk to 5,000-6,000 people? Right? Without Twitter.
In your articles.
If I was relying on somebody to buy the newspaper for my article, I suspect it wouldn't be worth the 2 hours it takes me to write an article.
Yeah. I would probably never know about it.
Yeah.
Nowadays we see it.
But you only see it online, which unfortunately doesn't monetize. And therefore the newspapers will stop asking to write.
You just don't know how to monetize.
Probably.
Because I think if you could transcribe it to AI and make a video out of it and post it on TikTok, should do good.
And then it goes virility. It goes viral.
And you can have an AI do a video background for you, and then you have those words just come up.
So over the next 2 years, this is what I'm going to do.
New business venture.
Yeah, new business venture, actually a social venture, right?
Yeah.
In the sense that, it'll make some money maybe. And then the other thing, I think the other part of your question is like, where is this country going over the next 2 years? So we're leaning into probably one of the most, and I don't want to be pessimistic about it, but I think if by being realist, I would say we're leaning into one of the most brutal elections, right?
Yeah.
It's got all the signs of, a crisis, right? From levels of credibility around the Electoral Commission and its ability to be able to count all the votes that are valid and pronounce the winner or winners, to things like, for example, ability to use technology to be able to capture our votes, to the disinformation and the misinformation that you will see in the campaigns. Everything about the elections at the moment looks a little bit
scary.
Yeah. So I think what we have to do is essentially begin to have some serious conversations about how to limit the abuse of our vote, to expand the right to vote, because there are so many Kenyans who just at the moment are really, if they wanted to vote, don't know whether they're going to get IDs in time.
Yeah, Gen Zs have been saying they're not getting their IDs anyway.
Yeah. I would push back with them and say, listen, take 500 of you and go and stand outside the IEBC and demand registration, right? There is nothing unlawful about demanding the right to vote. Secondly, there is nothing that stops the Electoral Commission, even before they appoint commissioners, registering. It is essentially supposed to be a continuous process.
Yeah.
And it doesn't cost anything for people to be registered.
Yeah.
Go for it. Demand it. All over the country.
We should mobilize again.
Yes. There is nothing in this country, unfortunately, like Frederick Douglass would say 400 years ago, there is nothing that happens in this country without an organized demand.
Yeah, that's very true. Anyway, good riddance to the people as we close the podcast. If there's one thing...
Which ones are we giving good riddance to?
It's a lot though.
Okay.
The elderly, the young, the children.
More power.
What's your generation?
My generation. So I am the independence generation, or I call ourselves the freedom generation. Some people...
It's nothing like that.
No, it is true. We're not baby boomers. No, we're not baby boomers. Because actually there were no babies booming when we were born. That is an American construct. No. That's an American construct. Our generation is defined by we brought independence.
You were there?
Yeah, 63.
How old are you?
I was at Mau at 3.
You've just told us when you were born.
That's okay. It's public record.
Data.
Yeah.
Protection.
Please scrap that.
Anyway, good riddance to the good people who are going to watch this.
Yes.
If there was one thing you were given a chance to tell the country right now, what would that be? Your
data is your wealth. Your data is your right. And secondly, that you have the right to essentially consent to your data being used, and also for your data to be erased. That's something we often forget, is that we give over our data, but we don't demand a point at which the data will be erased. And I think that would be my message. And go register to vote if you don't have a voter's card.
NB. Point to note. Go register your vote.
Yes.
Otherwise, thank you so much for being here and making such a difficult topic very simple. And I like the fact that you're actually a Gen Z at heart.
Yes. Part of my heart.
Thank you so much for being part of this podcast. I have been your host, Zaha Speaks. See you again. Speak Up Afrika is a digital platform that creates space for digital conversations to be made, specifically from end-to-end, from the users of the technological spaces, to the producers of it, to the creators, to the innovators, to the labor rights, to the policy increments, to governance, and all other technological dimensions. This is Speak Up Afrika. I am Zaha Speaks. We inform, engage, and empower.